So Transnet's former chief executive Brian Molefe and former finance executive Anoj Singh are among the 4 people that appeared in court following arrests made by the NPA's investigating Directorate yesterday. The arrests are in connection with a 93 million rand corruption and fraud case that's linked to the procurement of over 1,000 locomotives in 2015. Meanwhile, civil society organisation Open Secrets has released a report, Bad Cops, Bad Lawyers, on how the Hawks and the NPA's effectiveness in tackling the state capture cases. Now, investigating the networks of capture and corruption at 4 state entities, Open Secrets says it has identified about 30 names of individuals and companies against which the organisation will be opening its own criminal cases. Head of Investigations at Open Secrets, Michael Marchant, and Accountability Now Director, Advocate Paul Hoffman, join us virtually for this conversation. Advocate, Michael, great to have you. Thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure, I'm sure.
So, Michael, let me begin with you, because early last month, Open Secrets released this report that traces the networks of capture and corruption at PRASA, SAA, Denel, SARS. And now the NPA has arrested PRASA's former executives implicated on state capture. What is your reaction to this?
Thanks very much, Leanne. Look, I think that there's understandable excitement from the public when we see arrests. And in this case, particularly with the arrest of Brian Molefe and Anoj Singh, the excitement is because there were such key nodes of the state capture network. So if we look at the case of Transnet accounted for over 70% of the contracts that were tainted by state capture. It was an extraordinary site of extraction for the Gupta network and others, and particularly with the procurements of the locomotives. And it could not have happened without Molefe and Singh. And so there's understandable excitement, I think, in general, when we see the arrests. I think where there needs to be an element of caution, and we've certainly been expressing that with our concern around the work of the NPA and the Hawks, is that arresting someone is one thing, being ready to proceed in court is another, and that is something that we still haven't seen from the NPA. So in this particular case, this is the same case where the first arrests were made nearly a year ago, when Kuben Woodley was arrested in September of last year. And since then, when the NPA arrives in court, it keeps saying, well, we're not ready to proceed and provide full charge sheets yet because further arrests will be made. And of course, at a certain point in time, that may be legitimate. You may be holding back with a view to future arrests. But it does raise the concern about when the NPA will be ready to move on a case like this, and particularly when it starts to give possible wiggle room to those accused. We already saw defense lawyers yesterday coming out very strongly saying, well, my client was arrested nearly a year ago and you're still not ready to proceed in court, and that's going to prejudice us. And I think that really will be the true test, is when the NPA can arrive. Their next court date on the Transnet matter is in October, and say, here are the charge sheets, and let's proceed.
Yeah, and this is the frustration in South Africans, because, as you say, we've kind of been here before. And Advocate Hoffman, this is where I bring you in, because you're not convinced that these arrests are a foolproof case. According to you, what happened yesterday was, once again, just the NPA playing to the gallery. What are the misgivings you're seeing here?
Yes, I think that, Leanne, if we take a long view of this disaster that we have fallen into because of state capture and the ravages of the Zuma years, let's remember where we were when we started. We had the Scorpions then. They were able to investigate and prosecute successfully in one unit within the NPA. And they were closed down because of their success. They were going after too many well-connected businessmen and too many leading members of the ANC, including Mr. Zuma himself. So what we got in their place in order to decimate the effectiveness of the criminal justice administration was the Hawks and the NPA working in separate silos on the investigation by the Hawks and the prosecution by the NPA. And what we have as a result of that is a limping system that has been hollowed out, really gutted by state capture. And we have hordes of saboteurs in the leadership, let alone in the ranks of the NPA and the Hawks, whose primary function is to see to it that those who are responsible for state capture enjoy impunity indefinitely. And I'm not as optimistic as Michael is about what we saw in court yesterday. What we saw in court yesterday was a public relations exercise. It was not a serious start of a criminal case. The charge sheet, which is fundamental, is not complete. The number of accused has not been decided upon yet. The investigation is not complete. You can take poison that on the 14th of October, the case will be postponed again and the prosecution will be in disarray because it lacks the will, the skill, the resources, and the capacity to take on heavyweight, serious corruption cases.
So what do you think is at play here? Again, I'll come to you, Advocate. I mean, I've heard you saying that this is political pressure, that the NPA bowed to political pressure. Do you think that's what yesterday's show was all about, if they don't have enough already?
Yes, I'm afraid the cure to the problem is to reform the criminal justice administration. Yesterday, the president appointed a National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council. Now, all that council can do is tell the president what the law requires. The Glenister cases very clearly spell out what we need in anti-corruption machinery of state. And it's very clear that for more than 10 years, we have not had effective and efficient anti-corruption machinery of state. Accountability now has been crying, begging, pleading for the creation of an integrity commission under Chapter 9 of the Constitution that will be able to prevent, combat, investigate, and prosecute serious corruption of the kind that we have under discussion in court yesterday, in a manner that complies with the court orders that are in place. This is not an optional thing. It's a court order that binds the state. I don't know why we need an advisory council when the recipe has already been presented and no cake has been cooked.
Yeah, another council, another advisory panel. Do we know how many? Have we lost count yet? How many panels has the president put together? This is just the latest.
Yes, well, it's a way of kicking the can down the road, I'm afraid.
Well, that's how it appears, unfortunately. That's the problem. Let's get back, Michael, to the case now. So yesterday, the arrest, we saw this. It was in connection with a 93 million rand corruption and fraud case that was linked to the procurement of over 1,000 locomotives in 2015. Many of us won't forget that story. Now, the Commission state capture report cited this as the worst case, and it detailed how Transnet became the primary site of looting. Do you think that's the reason why the NPA actually started with Pras's former executives?
I definitely think that's contributed to it. And I think that there's little doubt that the National Prosecuting Authority would have identified Transnet and Eskom as two of the largest cases of state capture and capture that they needed to pursue. And of course, those cases are deeply complex. I think what is troubling, again, to go to this point about delay, is that we keep speaking about the NPA working, on the recommendations of the Zondo Commission, but a lot of the evidence regarding the corruption at Transnet far predates the Zondo Commission. And so in many cases, the Zondo Commission was confirming what had been written about extensively in the public domain and confirmed the conduct in that regard. I mean, to return to why it is so important in this case, is that the procurement for those locomotives from Transnet was escalated by about 16 billion rand. 7 billion around about of that was directly funneled into the Gupta enterprise. And that's predominantly from the evidence of Paul Holden that was given to the commission late last year that showed those money flows very specifically. What is important to remember here is that it does not appear, and again, we don't have final charge sheets, but it does not appear that any of these charges relate to the procurement itself. In fact, what they relate to is the payment to Trillian and regiments for the raising of funds for the loans for the procurement, because in many instances, the Transnet case was a case of corruption in two halves. It was the escalation of the cost of the trains themselves, and then funneling money to consultants and advisors when raising the loans for Transnet to undertake that type of procurement. Why this is so important, and something we haven't mentioned yet, but is always important to keep in mind, is that Transnet, the human and public and social cost of what happened at Transnet is extraordinary, because it's not just the money lost to the public procurement system. It is the destruction of Transnet's infrastructure that has had massive knock-on effects for the South African economy. And on top of that, all the foregone jobs that have been lost at Transnet and elsewhere due to state capture. And that's why acting on this case is so important.
Yeah, it is important. And I mean, it's the frustration of, as we say, I mean, we've been seeing these so-called investigations going on for so long, and yet no real convictions. That's the bottom line. So we see them standing in the docks, but then where to from here? Open Secrets, again, I said this in introduction, has identified about 30 names of individuals and companies compiled through evidence submitted to the Zondo Commission, NPA documents, court judgments, investigative reports, against which the organisation said that it's going to open its own criminal cases. So I suppose my question to you is, will you still be opening those criminal cases even if arrests are made, such as the ones we saw taking place yesterday?
So, Leanne, I think that there's two things to note in that regard. The one is that where we see arrests and cases enrolled in direct relation to those cases, we would, of course, provide the information to the authorities in the case that it's helpful, but we would likely not be opening our own criminal cases in terms of duplication. The other thing that I think Open Secrets is increasingly realizing is that in many instances, due to the kind of delays that we've been speaking about this morning, that criminal cases will not always be the best time, the best way for us to spend our resources. And so what we are increasingly doing is looking at alternative routes to accountability, which includes complaints to professional bodies. When it comes to professionals, lawyers and others, complaints to the Legal Practice Council, and other routes like that to try and pursue civil remedies. What we've seen from certain other areas of state capture is that it can be, in addition to criminal process, it can be equally powerful, for example, to get delinquent directors' orders to ensure that people implicated in state capture can no longer be the directors of companies, and to get other regulatory bodies in the professional space to act. The other thing, Leanne, that you mentioned in the introduction, of course, is our second report, the follow-on report to that report where we identified those 30 individuals. And in that report, we identified the individuals within the National Prosecuting Authority who have very serious accusations against them, including in evidence to the Zondo Commission, of them unduly delaying cases and failing to act in line with the NPA's prosecution policy. And I think that's another thing that we are going to be following up on very vigorously, is to say to the NPA, in addition to us seeing action in case arrests being made, but also cases being enrolled and pursued in court, we also need to see action internally against those of their own prosecutors who are implicated in wrongdoing, full investigations, the results of which must be made publicly available so that we know that we can have faith in the prosecuting authority and that those accusations that have been made against those prosecutors at the Zondo Commission have been fully investigated.
Yeah, very, very important. Just to further on to this, I mean, when we look at some of the directors, I mean, barring Dudu Myeni, who we know what has happened and we know what's been said towards her and her sort of positions held going forward, has this happened to anybody else?
So in terms of, there's a few different routes that it can take. So we saw with regards to the private sector, we saw for the first time in regard to Steinhoff last week, the former CFO of Steinhoff, the JSE barring him from directorship for a number of years for signing off transactions in relation to the Jooste fraud at Steinhoff. And so we've seen one example of that. But in many cases, we haven't seen it to the extent that we would like. And this does raise an important point. The Dudu Myeni example is a great example because it was really outer a civil society organization that drove that together with the South African Airways Pilots Association to get that delinquency application. And of course, the organizations and entities best placed to pursue those types of remedies are in many cases the state-owned enterprises themselves, because they are the entities that suffered the grave harm. And we have seen, for example, signs of regeneration, particularly at places like Transnet under new leadership. But even there, we've seen them to be slow to act against these types of individuals. And in addition to the work of the independent law enforcement bodies that we've been speaking about, I think arguably we'd want to see a lot more action and swifter action from Eskom, Transnet themselves to take on those types of civil cases themselves. They know, obviously, internally exactly what happened, and they're very well placed to make those types of delinquency applications and others.
Advocate Hoffman, just a question to you. If something goes wrong with these high-profile arrests that we saw taking place, how much damage will this do to the NPA and the Hawks? I mean, these are top strategic law enforcement entities. If this goes wrong, what does this show us?
It shows us that they are not up to the task at hand, and that it is in fact time to reform the criminal justice administration so as to capacitate it to deal with serious corruption. Corruption kills. It's the reason why there is so much hunger and poverty. It's the reason why 64% of the young people in South Africa are unemployed. It is actually destroying our society, and we cannot possibly hope to counter corruption adequately with the material that is available within the Hawks and within the NPA at the moment. What we need to do is to urgently create a new body that is put in place to prevent, combat, investigate, and prosecute all under one roof. The Constitutional Court decisions in this regard is really honored in the breach by the administration at the moment, and it is not the NPA's fault that it lacks independence and that it lacks resources. It's government's fault. Parliament is meant to exercise oversight over the implementation of the legislation that was put in place after the Scorpions were disbanded by Jacob Zuma and his cronies. That oversight involves necessary reform of the criminal justice administration to put in place the type of anti-corruption machinery, the single entity anti-corruption machinery that can effectively and efficiently, working independently of the executive branch of government, put the criminals into orange overalls and rake back the loot of state capture, which would be very useful in rebuilding South Africa from the ravages of state capture.
All right. Thank you. Advocate, thanks so much for your time. That's Advocate Paul Hoffman talking to us and giving us feedback on his views with regard to the arrests that took place yesterday, and of course Open Secrets as well talking to us. I didn't get to ask you my final question, where I was wanting to talk about the recommendations on that final state capture part. They ran out of funds at that time, where they actually wanted to give the recommendations on the NPA and the Hawks. If I may ask you one final word, just in terms from Open Secrets, what do you imagine the recommendations should have been made by the state capture report for these entities, or to these entities?
Yes, Leanne, I mean, it was very disappointing, I think, that the Zondo Commission held back from making those findings, or was unable to make any findings in the end. But I think that I would suggest, or we would suggest at Open Secrets, that it is twofold. The one is to deal with the very serious allegations that have been made against prosecutors. We have an affidavit from a senior MPA official given to the Zondo Commission alleging that prosecutors were enablers or aiders and abettors of state capture, that they deliberately held up cases that were relevant to corruption. And so what we would have wanted to see is the Zondo Commission coming out strongly to say those prosecutors must be the subject of a full independent investigation. And then when appropriate, action needs to be taken to remove those people from within the entity that are delaying state capture cases and pursuing cases without adequate evidence. That's absolutely fundamental. And then I think linked to that is the point that Advocate Hoffman has been making throughout, is that it's about addressing the past, getting rid of people in the institutions where they are not fit to hold those positions, but also for us to recognize where the structural deficiencies are. And I think it's unambiguous that the Hawks in particular is insufficiently independent. We have to build more independent capacity. And then we need to build the architecture that can really, without fear or favor, tackle state capture and systemic corruption.
Michael Marchant, thank you. Thanks so much for talking to us as well. And again, Advocate Hoffman, thanks so much to you.